welcome everyone to our monthly seminar and conversations on the laws of social reproduction. As we know, the situation is quite dire in India with the second wave of the pandemic. But we also have today a very special speaker who has shown us that the cause of social justice is particularly urgent during an event like a pandemic. So I'm delighted to introduce today a lawyer, Avani Chokshi, who is a practicing advocate in Bangalore, and she's a member of the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist Liberation. She obtained her law degree at NUJS Calcutta, and she has a litigation practice at Manthan Law, and she represents workers in labor court. So her practice is highly political, she says, and she has been extensively involved in working with migrant workers and workers in the unorganized sector, particularly in Bangalore during the two lockdowns that we have witnessed over the past several months. So through unions of workers, Avani tries to ensure that workers collectivize so that they can claim their legal rights and have a life with dignity. So over to you, Avani. She's going to speak today to us about the situation of domestic workers in Bangalore, on behalf of whom she has filed a public interest lawsuit before the Karnataka High Court. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Prabha. Am I audible?
Yes.
So first, I'd like to thank you so much for calling me to speak here. It's a really important issue which often goes unrecognized and invisibilized, as is the work of domestic workers often. So domestic workers, I'll just go straight into it. I'm going to limit, I think, our discussion to around 20 minutes and to my speaking for 20 minutes, and then we can have a discussion. So I think the entire idea of paid domestic work in India and specifically also in Bangalore is that you have workers who are facing an immense amount of discrimination and exploitation because of the very nature of their job. So they are not considered productive workers, and they face exploitation and discrimination. They face non-payment of wages, sexual harassment, and various other issues because of the unorganized nature of their work and the the peculiarities of their work. In fact, the number of paid domestic workers in India is massive. Even central government estimates in as early as 2012 said there are 39 lakh domestic workers in India, and this is a great underestimate according to the union. So I just want to clarify that I am one of the advocates on record for the Domestic Workers' Rights Union, and it's the Domestic Workers' Rights Union which has filed the PIL before the Honorable Karnataka High Court. So when we look at the situation which domestic workers are in, you see that one of the peculiarities is that they face oppression like several other categories of workers on three fronts. First, on the front of caste, you have a research article published in respect of domestic workers in Bangalore in 2013, where an empirical survey shows that out of all the domestic workers, you have as many as 75% belonging to the scheduled castes. So we have 75% scheduled castes, 15% OBCs, 8% scheduled tribe, and 2% general category. Then you have as much as what can be called as much as a crisis of caste in domestic work. That everyone in doing this work for money is of what is historically a backward class and faces oppression on that front. Secondly and thirdly, of course, you have oppression faced on grounds of class, and thirdly on grounds of gender. So official estimates say that around 2/3 of all domestic workers are women, but according to the union, it's far more. And most domestic workers are women, especially in Bangalore and Karnataka. So when you are looking at a accumulation of these three modes of oppression upon a worker, you see that these type of workers have to have specific protections given to them legally in order for them to live lives of dignity. Living a life of dignity is a right protected under Article 21 of the Constitution. That's a fundamental right to life, but not only a mere life of animal subsistence, but you have a life of dignity. That's your fundamental right. Unfortunately, that right is not realized to most paid domestic workers. So, insofar as the law is concerned, which governs domestic workers in India, you don't have a very specific enactment, no comprehensive specific legislation on domestic work. What you do have is a 2008 statute, which is the Unorganized Workers Social Security Act. This statute was intended to cover all unorganized workers and grant them certain rights. But the unfortunate fact is that no specific right itself is granted by this act. What this act does is that it gives you a right only to registration. And it says that central government and state government may and shall formulate certain schemes which shall be granted for the benefit of the workers who are registered under the act. Now, importantly, this is not limited to domestic workers. This is the Unorganized Workers Act. So it's for all categories of unorganized workers. And what you see is the schemes which are covered under the act are general schemes. These are insurance schemes, healthcare schemes, maternity schemes, for which no registration under the act is actually required. So if you see the act, the only right which the act gives you per se is a right to registration and a right to a smart card saying you are an unorganized worker. If you see Karnataka state in particular, you have failures on the registration front even. So whereas, so the latest data we have is from 2019, which is uploaded on the website. And in 2019, what the government says is we got around 60,000 applications for registration of unorganized workers, and 25,000 smart cards have been printed and distributed, which means that even as of 2019, which is 11 years after the enactment of the act, you have a shortfall of 35,000 applications, more than 35,000 applications. And the petitioner, that's the Domestic Workers' Rights Union, that itself has filed more than 4,500 applications, of which only 500 workers have been registered. Now, this non-registration of domestic workers is not something new. This is something which has even been considered by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of India has actually taken up the issue of registration and rights of domestic workers in a 2012 matter, sorry, which is a continuing case. So that case has been taken up from 2012 to 2020 semi-regularly without much being done, in fact. So what you do have is some really helpful orders. There's an order in 2018 where the Supreme Court in this matter has said that the central government should not give any further grants to states which have not registered domestic workers. Of course, there's been no implementation of this order on the ground, and the audits of the Unorganized Worker Social Security Board show that there's more than 24 crore balance in this registration scheme nearly. So they have sufficient money, they have everything necessary. The setup is there, the office, the staff, the building, everything is there. But unfortunately, the registrations are just not happening. Even the 500 workers in the union who have been registered have not got any benefit from the registration. The registration is a process which the union feels is important to embark on and to have that registration. But having that registration has not led to any benefit for any domestic worker as yet. The benefits which have been received, such as insurance, contributory pension, all of these are schemes which exist otherwise and for which other application forms, other entire procedures are laid down. So your registration as a domestic worker or as an unorganized worker does not give you any particular right. So if we look at the context of the lockdown had a very terrible impact on domestic workers. I just also want to take you through a couple of documents. Prabha actually showed me how to screen share and Prabha. I just want to take you through some documents at this stage to show you what the effect of the lockdown was on domestic workers. So if you, the Domestic Workers' Rights Union, who I'm representing, they came out with a report in the first lockdown. Can you see my screen, Prabha?
Not yet.
Now?
Yeah.
Perfect. So this is a report of this this is a summary of the report which the union had drafted, had come out with. And if you see that there is there's a survey of 2,500 domestic workers, out of which more than 2,000 domestic workers were told not to come to work after the lockdown. This is in the first lockdown. And you have 91% of domestic workers not being paid. This is a photo of one of the peaceful protests done by the members of the union demanding their rights. So this is the situation you saw in the first lockdown, and the situation was also highlighted to such an extent that the situation was also highlighted to such an extent that even the NHRC had to issue an advisory wherein specifically the issue of domestic workers was considered. So what you had is you have an exacerbation of discriminatory practices against domestic workers. You Everything has to, of course, be considered in the context of class and caste. So these ideas of purity, these ideas of pollution, which people hold in their mind, especially in this time of COVID, have become greatly exacerbated. They've increased to never before levels. So you do have, even previously, you have domestic workers being told to use a separate toilet, to use separate utensils, to sit on the ground and not on the chairs, to not use the common lifts. These are certain practices which happened even previously, but the workers say that now it's just on a different level. The degrading practices against them, and it's just terrible. So in this context, I had mentioned the NHRC advisory that was in October of last year. I'm just going to show you the relevant clause. Um, yeah. So if you see clause 3.5 here, domestic workers must not be discriminated against or looked at as high-risk individuals. RWAs, that's Resident Welfare Associations, must be strongly notified not to take any discriminatory measures in the name of protection. For example, RWAs cannot stop domestic workers from taking lifts using common areas. Guards and facility managers must be trained in treating domestic workers with due respect. Proper training on physical distancing must be provided by the facility management or employers to the domestic workers, along with face masks, gloves, and hand sanitizers. So what you have is a situation where even the National Human Rights Commission is stepping in to say that this is happening on such a large scale that we need to actually do something about this. So this is an advisory issued by the NHRC, which has been placed by us in the petition. Now, if you come to what happens in the second lockdown, you have COVID rising to a level not seen before. Whereas in the first lockdown, what we saw is that the livelihoods of workers were impacted to a great extent. Now you see that lives are being destroyed to a never before extent. So what you see is that the government takes various measures, imposes various restrictions, and imposes some level of lockdown in Bangalore. And at this time, you have the BBMP, which is the municipal authority, releasing an advisory for RWAs. I'm going to show you that as well because it's simply horrifying. And that, um, yeah. If you see this provision, which I've placed here, it says all maids, helpers should be screened periodically once in 15 days, tested with RT-PCR test, and carry with negative report. This is an advisory issued by the BBMP. So if you see that advisory, basically the entire burden of proving yourself to be tested negative is placed on the domestic worker who's already in a weaker bargaining power, a position of weaker bargaining power. She is someone who's going to 3 to 4 days, 3 to 4 houses on a daily basis, trying to ensure that her livelihood is saved. And she's basically mandated now to get an RT-PCR report. Now, an RT-PCR report, even if right now at the stage Bangalore is in, you get tested and you'll get the report in a couple of days, despite the High Court order saying that it must come within 24 hours. That usually, by and large, does not seem to be complied with. And moreover, you do have free fever clinics, as they are called by the government, where you can get free testing. But it's very hard to get tested in some of these places, and they're very crowded. And if you want to get tested in a private establishment, then the amount of money you have to pay is something which would be unworkable for most domestic workers on a regular basis. So this is the situation. And you do see that the Unorganized Workers Social Security Board of Karnataka, which is supposed to look after the benefit of unorganized workers, has done so for various categories of workers but not domestic workers, despite the repeated requests of the union to have some sort of benefits given to them in view of the and total deprivation of livelihood during these times. So in the last lockdown, you had schemes, special schemes for barbers, construction workers, free passes for those who required it. You had certain ex gratia amounts being paid to auto drivers. So various categories of vulnerable workers who lost their livelihoods were protected and granted social security in some form or the other. But domestic workers have been absolutely missed out in the entire process. Um, so I just want to raise a few other issues in respect of domestic workers. One is that there's a rampant non-payment of minimum wage. So we have a minimum wage act in India which regulates the minimum wages that workers are entitled to across various segments. And in Karnataka, you do have domestic workers specifically covered. Um, I will again share the screen for minimum wages to show you how much minimum wages workers are entitled to. So if you see, there are various categories of employments like cutting vegetables, washing clothes, taking care of children, and for each of these categories of work, you have a per day and per month minimum wage for each zone. Zone one would be Bangalore City, the capital, and you have various other zones for which have been already notified. So, given that, what you actually have happening is that domestic workers, unless they're live-in domestic workers, often go to various households in a day. They do 4 or 5 households in a day, and they work for many hours without getting the correct amount of minimum wage. And of course, the minimum wage, even the scheduled minimum wage, is not sufficient. The Minimum Wage Act prescribes that it must be revised at the minimum at least 5 years, but like at the maximum at least every 5 years. But now, after 17 years of domestic workers having been scheduled, the notification has been revised only twice, and we are now functioning on a notification of 2016. So 5 years have passed, but there's been no revision in the minimum wages. The second thing I'd like to just bring to your attention is the rampant sexual harassment you see. So you have various categories of domestic workers. One are migrant domestic workers, some are part-time domestic workers, some are child domestic workers, some are live-in domestic workers, and each of these categories face their own problems and hardships. So domestic workers, since they are primarily predominantly not unionized, they often don't find themselves having any recourse to any remedy. The employers they work with are usually the ones perpetrating the sexual harassment upon them, and they find themselves unable to reach out to the employer, and they don't know who else to reach out to. You do have a Sexual Harassment Act, a Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act in India, which is a 2013 legislation, which provides for creation of internal complaints committees or local complaints committees. So for domestic workers, since the number of domestic workers in each establishment will be low, maybe one or two, you are supposed to have a local complaints committee which registers complaints and takes it forward. But unfortunately, though the committees are they are they are they are created but practically dysfunctional. So we do have representations from the union we have given on multiple occasions, stating the facts of sexual harassment upon a worker where no action has been taken. And the last aspect I want to go into is this entire aspect of a legal vacuum. Now, I think before we started the discussion, we were talking about various other countries and the ILO conventions on this. So you have an ILO convention number 89, which is from 2011, where you have the idea that domestic work must be decent work. This idea of decent work and work with dignity, that is encapsulated in this very detailed convention. I just want to take you through Article 3. I think my time is done. I'm just ending up. I just want to take you through Article 3 of this convention. I'm just finding it, where the fundamental principles regarding the uh, the rights of domestic workers are laid out. If you can see it, the clause 2 of Article 3 talks about the fundamental principles of at and rights at work, which are: one, the freedom of association and effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining; second, the elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor; third, the effective abolition of child labor; and fourth, the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. Now, these are all principles which are gravely required right now in India today. You don't have these principles being applied at all. In fact, non-payment of minimum wages even has been held by the Supreme Court to be forced labor. If you, it's practically slavery if you're not giving minimum wage, since the compulsion upon you might not be physical to do the work, but there's economic compulsion upon you to do this work at less than minimum wage, and that would amount to forced labor in the terms of the orders of the Honorable Supreme Court. So in our petition, I just want to end with that we have asked for a few prayers, but we have specifically asked for a prayer that guidelines in line with the ILO convention must be laid down by the Supreme Court. There's sufficient authority saying that the Supreme Court, in case of any vacuum of legislation, can step in and read in international conventions which are not contradictory to national law. So we have asked for implementation of guidelines, and of course, we have asked for several other reliefs, including registration, provision of benefits, and other reliefs. Yeah, this was just a broad outline for all of you. I think we can move on to like the discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Avani, for your presentation. I think you've given us a lot to think about. So we tend to the format tends to be quite informal. So I'm happy for people to just raise their hands or just unmute yourselves and pose a question to Avani. Yeah, Shakti, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much, Avani. That was really fascinating. I was just wondering if you could just tell us again the minimum wages. And I just didn't catch that. I didn't catch the actual figures in the slide, and I just wanted to.
I can just show you that document again. Let me just go to it. I closed it. 1 second. So this is sorry, just excuse me. Sorry. Yeah, so this is the document in respect of minimum wages. Are you able to see it? So this is the document. This is not the notification itself because the notification is in Kannada, but this is a compilation of the minimum rates of wages. This is a 2016 notification. The Minimum Wages Act is 1948. I think domestic work was brought into the Karnataka schedule in 2011, if I'm correct. I just have to check that the date. I think perhaps 2008. I'll just have to check that date. And this is the schedule.
VDA.
Yeah.
What is VDA?
So VDA is variable dearness allowance. The idea that yeah, you have to combat inflation. So on Karnataka level, you have a revision of VDA every once a year, and on the central level, you have it twice a year.
Oh, I see. Okay, okay. And then each of the tasks is considered like what would be the minimum wage if someone were doing all of it? Because most domestic work involves some amount of all of these. Oh, are they?
Yeah. So there's no real clarity on how that works. So how it generally works is that you have categories of workers. So this is not how it generally works in other schedules of minimum wage. For example, if you look at factory workers, you would have highly skilled, skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled type of categorization. I think they have attempted to do something like this over here, but you are absolutely right. Domestic workers do many forms of domestic work. So in the union's understanding, it would obviously be that the highest classification must be provided to you, and that would be what would be demanded.
Right. And I just had one other question, which was, is there any information on the extent to which domestic workers also take loans from their employers, and sort of oftentimes I know it's a situation where they would take a loan and then the employer will exhaust it again in lieu of wages for a certain number of months, and then I just didn't know the terms on which that happened, if the union had any knowledge.
So the union has faced such cases where you have basically practically a system of bondage where the domestic worker has either taken a loan or certain money of the domestic worker is kept in safety with the employer, and you have a situation of practical bondage being created where the worker is forced to continue. If the worker is able to access the union, there's some sort of remedy for them. But unfortunately, most domestic workers are not unionized, so they don't have any real recourse. And even if they do go to the police station, the inequality of bargaining power is just extreme. So it's very hard to get an actual remedy for domestic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, just really a very rich lot to think about. Thanks so much for this very important presentation.
Didi?
Hello, hi. My name is Didi Lucy. I'm from Global Women's Strike. Thank you so much for what you've told us about the situation of domestic workers in India, and also the organizing that the union is doing and the legal cases you're taking. It was quite fast for me. I was sort of trying to take notes because we are organizing with some of us are domestic workers in different countries. We're organizing with the domestic workers organization Fentrahop in Peru, who have won, you may know, they won a law based on the ILO convention that you've talked about. And they are really pushing now for implementation of that law, which defends domestic workers, the 8-hour day, against the sexual harassment, against non-payment of wages, and so women can also leave and don't have to stay overnight. Many of the things that you've described that people are that you are helping to fight for in India. We wanted to let them know about your organizing, so possibly they can be in touch with the domestic workers organization that you are representing. And also just to mention that Lady Mozambite, who's General Secretary of Fentrahop, the Domestic Workers Union, is also they're also pressing for unremunerated domestic work and caring work in the home to be recognized as work. And the two are so connected, as we know, because when mothers and women's work at home is not recognized, unpaid, the domestic work is not paid what it should be paid as well. But anyway, enough. Thank you so much for what you've told us. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Didi. I absolutely agree with what you said. And I'll give Prabha the contacts of people from the union, and you can have my contact, of course. So then it will be good, I think, for the unions to connect across countries, because the problems are the same.
Yeah. Yes, that would be great. Thank you so much. And also we are organizing with women, also Dalit and Adivasi women in Chhattisgarh, in the rural areas. So this again is an issue which, many of them are also domestic workers if they have to go to the city, and migrant laborers. So there's many connections to be made. Thank you so much. We would appreciate very much being in touch. Thank you.
I think while we wait for other questions, I think one of the things that struck me about your litigation, Avani, was how focused you were on the question of caste. I think a lot of people talk about intersectionality, but you don't really see it come through in legal argumentation, which I think your PIL did very well. So I'm also curious about your invocation of, Article 17, where you talk about, that it's the way domestic workers are treated is a violation of Article 17. You also bring up, the forced labor prohibition under Article 23. So I'm just curious about, how that was built into the PIL. Clearly it's come from the union, but how is it articulated? The question of caste, how is it articulated in terms of recognition of domestic work and in terms of, the demand for dignified work? So that was one question. The other quite creative argument that you're making in the petition is about how international law can be read into domestic law and how actually you can bypass the center, because I think the domestic workers movement has for a very long time been asking the Indian government, for a law, a separate legislation on domestic workers. And, this has been since the 50s, we've had this demand of the state, but what you're kind of coming up with is this demand of the Karnataka government to implement guidelines along the lines of the convention, until a legislation is enacted. So it's kind of an interesting way of, kind of doing something locally and bypassing the center. And I guess the third question I had was about how what is it about the moment of the pandemic that has, does it present certain possibilities for making your arguments be heard rather than at another time, pre-pandemic? Because clearly this is a very established movement, social movement in the Indian context.
Thanks. Those are big questions, but I'll try and answer them. I think if we talk about caste, the root of this is that our practice is political, and our practice is not coming simply as lawyers, but also as members of communist parties, as well as members of trade unions. So I think the understanding of caste and class, as well as gender, has to be political in the current context. And if you see Article 23, Article 17 you mentioned, which is the abolition of untouchability, the idea, if you see the Constituent Assembly debates when our constitution was being brought into force, the idea was not just that untouchability, you can't touch. Untouchability isn't limited to the idea of untouchability in its literal term. Untouchability is the idea that any casteist discriminatory practices being imposed on the basis of a caste you have no control over cannot be tolerated in a democratic country. So if you have that understanding, then you also do have to trace the very real impact of caste on people of various sectors. So as our union, our AICCTU, we also have a very large union of Paura Karmikas, or the sanitation workers who sweep the streets. So Paura Karmikas are, again, like domestic workers, face triple oppression on caste, class, and gender. And we have seen the very real impact of caste upon Paura Karmikas. Their lives are built around caste. If you speak to someone who's giving you their garbage, then there's just such a intrinsic hierarchy in the conversation. There was a case where someone offered food to a Paura Karmika but offered it in a plastic bag instead of giving it on a plate. The entire idea of caste is so intrinsic that it's impossible to ignore. And since our litigation is political, it's important to bring that in. Yeah, I think it's hard to go deeper into that now. I'll go to your second question, which is this bringing in of international law. Now, this is nothing new. You have this happening from, I think, 97 in India, where you have the Vishakha judgment, which brought in several regulations from international law, saying that if you have a vacuum in your local domestic legislation, then there's no bar on a court to bring in international law as long as it's not inconsistent. So from 1997 onwards, you have this being invoked not regularly, but to some extent in various cases of the Supreme Court. And the relatively recent judgment of the Supreme Court on this was the 2014 judgment on transgenders of the Supreme Court, which is the NALSA judgment. So, in that judgment in 2014, the Supreme Court specifically again says that any international law which is not inconsistent must be read in to if it promotes the fundamental rights of the people, the category of people you're talking to. There, they were speaking specifically in the context of the transgender community. But you do have that, and you have various other Supreme Court judgments saying that guidelines can be framed by the courts if there's a gap. So where there's a vacuum, the court can step in and protect the fundamental rights of whatever sector of people you're talking about. So if you like a cumulative analysis of this for us, it indicated that we can try and join the ILO convention and also ask for framing of guidelines to ensure that these rights are protected. And lastly, this idea of the lockdown, um, it's very heartbreaking to some extent what is happening. Uh, you have a lakhs of people dying, but not just dying of COVID. You have people dying because of the negligence of the center and the state governments. Not only you are seeing shortages of oxygen, essential medicines, beds, you are seeing a situation where the livelihoods of workers has not been protected to any extent whatsoever. Whereas in the first lockdown, you did see to some extent there were, for example, ration kits were notified to be provided to those who were needing. There were various provisions made to ensure that workers who are vulnerable have some level of security provided by the state. But this time around, you don't see that at all. I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly. I think your question was whether we have a easier access to the court at this time. But I think the access to court at this time, if at all it's easier, is because of the situation people are in. It's not a gift for us. This easier access. It's unfortunate.
Thank you very much, Avani. Shruti?
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Avani. That was a really great presentation. I learned so much. I think that this is a little bit of a big, kind of maybe a bit more abstract question, but just following on from the point that you made about how the legal arguments that you're making in this petition are kind of coming out of your political work as well, right? Like as within a communist party and as part of a trade union. I was just wondering how the use of the PIL then as a device fits into that broader strategy, because obviously PILs are often long, continuing affairs, very messy. It takes like a lot of initiative on the part of civil society organizations, to even get anything done. So I was just thinking, is the PIL a route to kind of also mobilize and organize on the ground, right? To make kinds of, as an organizing tool, or is it more like the PIL is like a vehicle to kind of get a judgment and then work on implementing it? Like, I mean, how is the party and the union actually visualizing the legal case? Yeah, thank you.
So this entire idea of PIL has gone through like massive transformation. You have a public interest litigation, the idea of which was initially that the strict legal principle of locus standi, or that you yourself must be affected to approach court. You have a dilution of that by Bhagwati in the Supreme Court in the 70s, I believe. I'm not sure of the date, but you have a dilution of this right of locus standi specifically to protect the interests of those who are less privileged. So that's where this idea is coming up from, that those who cannot themselves approach the court should have the right to have other people approach the court for them. And the court itself must take up issues of people's hardships, people's violation of rights, when it's evident that the workers themselves cannot themselves approach the court. So in that context, you of course do see then a transformation of PILs being used as what some call now publicity interest litigations. You have PILs where a purely personal cause is pursued. But the idea is that it's a very important tool available to us. Now, here we do have a domestic workers' rights union, and the union could have chosen to file a petition in its own name, a writ petition in its own name. But simply speaking, the idea of a PIL often becomes that a whole host of issues can be gone into, and the limitations on a judge in a PIL are often I mean, this is of course not strictly legally speaking, but in the context of a PIL, often judges find themselves able to go into various issues which haven't been raised in the pleadings. For example, we might have missed out many things in our case, but since it's a public interest litigation, there's no strict law that the judge only has to limit himself to our pleadings. He can just go into what he wants. And I think, politically speaking, I'm not sure of our political understanding of PILs. It's a tool which you're using to go somewhere. It's strategic to use a PIL at this moment. And you might get a beneficial order with the PIL, so that's what we chose. Yeah. I hope that I'm not sure if that was helpful.
No, that was great. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Arushi?
Thanks, Prabha, and thanks, Avani. Lovely to see you and great presentation. I was just wondering, does it complicate your petition at all that a lot of the discrimination that you're talking about happens in private or privatized spaces, sort of, private apartment complexes by private employers? Is that a challenge for you at all?
No, in fact, it's a massive, massive challenge, because the idea is that the discrimination which a worker faces arises out of that, that very private relation and the idea of the state that you can't like really interfere in private places. For example, if you see the Minimum Wages Act, for non-compliance of minimum wage, you have an understanding that workers might not always come out and say that we're not being paid minimum wage simply because of this economic compulsion I spoke about previously. So you do have a provision in the act which says inspectors may go and conduct such inspections anywhere and just check if the law is being followed or not. But we have never seen inspections in individual households checking whether there is payment of minimum wage or compliance of the law. Similarly, for sexual harassment, this idea of a private family becomes important, because sexual harassment, as per my discussions, of course, I'm maybe not the right person to speak about this. The union and the domestic workers themselves should speak about it. But my understanding of the sexual harassment that workers face, is that it becomes very hushed up. Even if they do raise it as an issue, it becomes very hushed up by the employer who is doing the sexual harassment, and then by the community. If you try and raise it in the RWA, the Resident Welfare Association, you do have attempts to kind of sort it out internally and not raise it as a issue. So you are absolutely right on that.
Thank you.
Just as a follow-up to what Arushi asked, I just wondered what is the role of the RWAs, because clearly they've become a very important intermediary between the state and the domestic workers, without any accountability yet, wielding a disproportionate amount of power. So what do you think are the possibilities for holding RWAs responsible in some ways, and federations also of RWAs in a fast-changing landscape in Bangalore? I think there have been news reports now that actually it's the apartment complexes that are being blamed for the spread of COVID, that it's the elite few who are living in these places who are forcing people to come work and not telling them that they're positive. So do you think there is some proactive role that RWAs and their associations can play in this process?
No, absolutely, you're right. The role of RWAs is very, very strange actually. So you have a group of people, employers coming together, and in a employer-employee relationship, you have people who have the power all banding together. You have a lot of people with power in the equation banding together, whereas the workers are not similarly associated into unions of RWA, domestic workers. So you have rules being imposed by RWAs, which many progressive people might not want to impose by themselves, but being imposed by the RWA as an external authority, one might say, taking discriminatory and oppressive decisions, such as recently, Geeta, who's from the union, told me that those domestic workers who have not been vaccinated cannot be enter one particular compound where there's an RWA. And that's a decision of the RWA. Now, there are no vaccines in Karnataka. It's impossible to get vaccinated if you're less than 45 years, because the vaccines are just absent. There's no stock of vaccines. So to have such a requirement is practically like a death blow to the livelihood of the domestic worker. But you do have such requirements, and I think the point to be understood here is there can be external regulation of what RWAs can and cannot do. So in 2014, you have the case of a particular domestic worker which came before the High Court, and during that time, that was an issue of trafficking, and at that time, the High Court pushed the government to come out with certain guidelines, and certain guidelines on trafficking and trafficking of domestic workers and migrant worker issues came out. And those guidelines allow for the Labor Department to give certain advisories to RWAs to direct for publication of notices that child labor won't be employed here. You have an idea that the Labor Department and other government departments can demand certain things of the RWA. So I think we need to work on that and push forward that idea that they're not simply unaccountable and can do whatever they want, but there must be a certain level of transparency and accountability about their actions. Yeah.
That's great, thank you. Didi, is that an old hand that you have up, or did you have something to ask?
No, I think it was from the past. Thank you.
Okay, that's wonderful. Are there any other questions for Avani? I mean, can you tell us a little bit about where the litigation is? What kind of orders have you been getting or hope to get in the near future?
I mean, we have been getting orders on this entire idea of registration, that the Chief Justice has taken that extremely seriously, that you have thousands of workers who have applied but not been registered despite the statutory mandate for registration. So that has been taken very seriously, with a directive for an official to be personally present in court and account for the non-registration of workers. But as I said, the registration per se does not grant you any benefits. We are hoping for orders around on various aspects. One is, of course, registration. One is on guidelines in line with the ILO convention. One is on sexual harassment, trafficking, registration of placement issues. Agencies becomes an issue. We've made several prayers. The thing is, with the pandemic at such a stage, it's very hard to push for hearing of the matter. We can if there's something specific we are asking for. So one of the things is, of course, food security of domestic workers. But that entire issue of food security is being taken up at a overall level. So the Karnataka High Court will be taking up the issue of food security of vulnerable populations, I think, on Tuesday. So it's not necessary to raise the same specifically in the context of domestic workers. That was our understanding as of now. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other final thoughts or reflections? I think obviously one of the main things that keeps coming up is, the demand for a separate law for domestic workers, and the fact that it's not forthcoming while you also have the consolidation of so many labor legislations. I mean, what is your own sense of whether, what might be the best legislative model for domestic workers? Should they be part of these kind of, laws that apply to the unorganized sector in general, or do you think, or where do you see the movement going? Because I know that the domestic workers movement is quite fractured in some ways, and you're representing a union that's also split away from the larger domestic workers movement in India. So I'm just curious what you think about, the possibilities for law reform.
I think we have to also keep in mind that this comes at a time when the central government and the state governments are doing their best to do away with all existing protections for workers. So you do have at center, you have 44 central legislations for protection of workmen in various categories being consolidated to 4 codes. But this is not a mere consolidation. It removes a huge number of protections which workers are entitled to. It practically criminalizes collective bargaining by imposing heavy penalties on workers who conduct strikes, who protest, and who are even involved in making payment of 1 rupee or 2 rupee to the same would allow you to be penalized, criminally penalized. So you have that as the larger context, and you have this idea of ease of doing business coming up to a massive extent. Of course, the understanding of the central government as a crony capitalist government, which is pushing the welfare of corporates, is our understanding, and our understanding is that the government is doing everything it can to reduce existing protections. In this context, it's very hard to ask for a specific and separate legislation. But the demand of the union from 2010 onwards has been for a separate specific legislation protecting the interests of domestic workers. In fact, the union I'm representing, as well as several other domestic worker rights unions, have actually come together and put together draft legislation, which is very, very interesting. This is after the 2011 legislation, the convention. What they did is they put together a legislation which they feel would be applicable to India and which could be used as a model for any legislation. You also have, I think, on a couple of occasions, draft bills being introduced in parliament and never being taken forward. But yeah, the demand is always for a separate, independent, specific legislation protecting the rights of domestic workers. How possible that is another issue.
Right. I think that's right. Okay. Are there any final thoughts from friends or on the call?
Actually, if there's no one else, may I come back?
Yeah.
Hi, this is thank you very much. This is Didi again. I'm sorry if I missed anything, but when you're talking about Karnataka, is the union, the domestic workers union that you are representing, does it have branches across different states of India? Or is it based in Karnataka?
The union I'm representing is based in Karnataka, and it has a presence in Bangalore and 2 other districts. So there are 3 districts in which it has a presence, but the substantial presence is in Bangalore city. It's not a nationwide union.
And which other 2 states does it have like representatives and members?
So you have India as the country, you have Karnataka as the state, and you have various districts within Karnataka.
Ah, okay.
So it has presence in 3 districts of Karnataka. I'll just have to check on that.
Oh no, that's okay. Thank you. So it's the 3 districts in Karnataka. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Meenakshi, go ahead. Meenakshi, go ahead. Can't hear her, but I think she has a question. Hi, Meenakshi.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are now.
Sorry. So I just wondered, one is, of course, that COVID has thrown up the issue of care workers worldwide. But at the same time, the almost indispensable status of domestic workers for, Indian households has also been to some extent challenged, where suddenly households have had to survive without domestic workers for months on end. I know a lot of family and friends who've invested in technology solutions, dishwashers, and so on. I know that doesn't wipe out the demand for domestic workers for sure, but does it in some way challenge their bargaining power and the power relations that, and you've seen in your work or anything very recent where there is some threat to their bargaining power now in the equation having shifted between how indispensable they were earlier considered and now possibly supplemented with other technology solutions?
I mean, you're right that several people have been managing without paid domestic work during this time. But I think that has actually exacerbated the need for domestic workers in people's lives. People are facing a really hard time surviving, doing their own work for once, and it's quite interesting what you are saying about shifting the bargaining power away from the domestic worker, because the domestic worker usually doesn't have any bargaining power in the equation. But This is just my understanding. I can't speak to what the situation is actually, but in my understanding, this does not have a negative effect on the rights of domestic workers, because yeah, people are seeing how indispensable they are, and those in my contact want them back. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I think that is really useful, and a note of hope. I think that that we should only that the bargaining power of domestic workers should possibly increase given the pandemic, and the need for paid domestic work. So I think so unless there are any final thoughts, I just want to thank you very, very much for this very important work, because I think it's rare to come across actually litigation that's been filed during the pandemic on behalf of domestic workers, despite their very sorry plight, I think, all over the country. So I think I just want to congratulate you on the petition, and really hope that a lot comes out of it. But I know that you have other pressing matters, including volunteering to get people hospital beds in Bangalore. So I don't want to keep you away from that work, but I want to thank you very, very much for taking some time out of your schedule and speaking with us. And we wish you all the best and hope you stay safe. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very